So I would just like to kick off with a little bit of an icebreaker question and ask our speakers to tell us about your background and what got you interested in being on a panel discussing this particular topic tonight.
This started for me actually when I was a college student. I was a political science major at Whitworth University, a small Christian college in the Pacific Northwest, when 9/11 happened. And so political science as a discipline shifted dramatically after 9/11. And we started taking faith and politics very seriously within the discipline. And in 2003, when I was graduating as a senior, the United States invaded Iraq. And at that time, there were a lot of refugees running from Iraq and Afghanistan into Europe. And I had heard news reports about this, and I was moved to go and volunteer in a UN refugee camp, actually in Eastern Europe. I was in Hungary. And there I met a lot of Muslim refugees as a young Christian college student, and spent the summer listening to their stories of war and poverty and religious strife, and reflecting on that as a Christian, and asking a lot of questions about what is my Christian response to this, these issues of Muslim and Christian violence and Muslim immigration. And fast forwarding, I'll skip a number of parts of my life story, but later on I began to study how Europeans were responding to Muslim immigrants as they moved from the Middle East into Europe. And the European response is somewhat complex, of course, but there are two sort of dominant voices in Europe over the last 10 years. One is a more hard right-wing nationalism that sort of will demonize Muslims and want to either push them out or assimilate them and try to make them like secular Europeans. And then the other side is a more, we might call a left-wing multiculturalism, which wanted to sort of accept Muslims and be very open to them, hoping that along the way Muslims would see that really European life is just the best thing ever. And they just hope that Muslims would slowly come to this sort of realization. So I was very interested in this debate that was raging in Europe over Muslim immigration, and spent time in Amsterdam, specifically as a Christian ethicist, asking how are Christians responding as Muslims move into their neighborhoods and into their cities? What sorts of responses are happening? And then as an ethicist, as a theologian, I ask, what ought Christians to do in these sorts of situations? How do we as Christians respond to deep difference and respond to the politics of fear and demonization? And how do we live together in these packed cities like Amsterdam or New York, where you have different religions and political ideologies living on top of each other? How do we do that? And so my book about Muslim immigration really came out of those experiences. So we can talk more about that later, but that's a little bit of the background of what got me into all these sorts of things.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that background. That really helps to put some to make it a personal story, and gives us a sense of that this is something you've been thinking and writing about for a long time. Dr. Malici, can I give you the same question? How do you make your way into these conversations?
Sure. Thank you very much. Can you hear me fine? Thank you very much to the Veritas Forum for having this. I must confess, I didn't know of the Veritas Forum a year ago, but since the invitation, I've been looking into, and I've been thoroughly impressed with the work that is being done. I also wish I could welcome Matthew on our campus and shake hands and be together. But hopefully God will grant us another opportunity in the not too distant future. a little bit about myself. I was born in Germany and grew up there, lived there most of my life, had most of my schooling there, went to college there. I'm not German though. My mother was from Turkey and my father was from what used to be Yugoslavia. Then, however, became Macedonia and then became the Northern Republic of Macedonia. We grew up in Germany, and I always loved Germany and continue loving Germany. Raised my children speaking German, but as immigrants, it wasn't always easy either, especially as Muslim immigrants to Germany. Eventually, I came to the United States, and also here I was of an immigrant background. In fact, I'm a lifelong immigrant, and I've been a lifelong minority wherever I lived. In fact, until I became United States citizen some years ago, I've never lived in a country in which I was a citizen. Was always an immigrant, was always a minority. So I think it's in good part because of this personal background that I came to develop some convictions about the value of going beyond coexistence. And I'm so fond participating in this forum because we have only one life to live and only one world to live in with all our differences. Only one America to live in. Only one Furman, and so on. And so we must get it right for everyone, regardless of who they are, their race, their ethnicity, their religion, and so on. Students who are listening, who had me in class before, they heard me talking about this many times. I'm a strong believer in education and its actual meaning, coming from the Latin, the prefix ex and the verb ducere, ex ducere, to lead yourself out of yourself. Education properly understood as leading oneself out of yourself. And I think the idea behind it is quite imperative, an ethical imperative or a divine command, I'd like to think. The idea behind it is that if I lead myself out of myself and you lead yourself out of yourself, whoever I am and whoever you are, and then somewhere out there, there's a space where we, people of difference, can come to know each other and begin co-authoring a better tomorrow for all of us. And in the Veritas forum, I see this kind of philosophy, this kind of conviction behind it, and that's why it's an honor for me to participate in this forum. I want to thank you for having me.
All right, well, marvelous. Thanks for that, Dr. Malici. And I think we're going to have some really good, diverse perspectives on the questions we're going to tackle tonight. So I'm just gonna wade right in on the first kind of big question that we're considering here, and that is the tension between the Christian impulse to evangelize and the need we have to engage in civil dialogue with our neighbors in a context of religious pluralism. So, you know, those are two, I think, very deeply seated and important impulses that both as citizens and as religious practitioners are at the front of our consciousness, I think more than ever in the 21st century. So I think we'll just maybe pitch this one back again to Dr. Kaemingk and ask, how do you, in your work, in your scholarship, in your teaching, how do you navigate that that desire to spread the reach of Christianity, to make disciples, and yet at the same time be mindful of and be aware of the need for civil engagement and civil dialogue in a context where not everyone's a Christian?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question and a really great one. And frankly, a lot of times Christians think about these things in terms of balance. They use the terms evangelism and justice, and they often think about it like a scale. Like, I need to do a little bit of evangelism, but I also need to do a little bit of justice, and these things need to balance out, right? Or they want to create a hierarchy between the two. And in general, with my students, I try to encourage them not to think that way, but to ask essentially, what is the greatest command that Jesus gives his followers, which is to love God and love your neighbor. And so I see evangelism and justice as parts of that greater command. So what that means for me is I must, in order to love my neighbor as myself, I need to do justice to them. I need to make space for them. I need to respect them. I need to be hospitable to them. And one of those things to love them is to share this story of what Jesus has done for me. So evangelism is always going to be a part of who I am. The Christian faith is, it cannot be understood without what we call witness, right? To witness to what we've experienced. However, the Christian life cannot be reduced to evangelism. The Christian life is so much bigger than that, and we are called to so much more. And furthermore, our God has made space for us so that we might make space for others. So a big part of my argument in my book and when I teach is that God has revealed God's self as a hospitable God who makes space not simply for those that agree with him, but for those who don't, and even for those who may be enemies. So our God calls us to a costly hospitality, an uncomfortable hospitality, a sacrificial hospitality. And if we live that sort of life, then evangelism, right, can come out of that love and that hospitality, and it makes sense. Now, with my Muslim neighbors, if I am cruel to them, if I make fun of them, if I enact all sorts of laws against them, and then I try to tell them about a God that is loving, it doesn't work super well. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So, so to me, I see these things as all part of that sort of core love command. So a Christian pluralism, comes out of that. And we can talk more about that as we go.
Dr. Malici, how I realize this question is written from with the assumption of a Christian audience in mind, and I think, given the fact that we're a liberal arts college in the Southeast, it's appropriate to acknowledge that Christianity is the big elephant in the room, and for a lot of immigrants, a lot of religious minorities, the way they experience evangelism or Christian hospitality looks really different when you're on the other side of a boundary that has been drawn. So I wonder how do you respond to this idea of the interplay between evangelization and civil dialogue?
I first want to say I almost felt I want to dedicate my allotted time to Matthew and keep listening to him because it was so beautiful and inspiring. And I think, and I hope he'll be one of the chief co-authors of it tomorrow that we can walk into. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure listening to you, Matthew. I can't speak about to this question from a Christian perspective, but I can speak to it about a little bit from a social science, from a political science perspective, and talk not about theological barriers or tensions that may exist between evangelizing and pluralism, but about some social and political barriers that may be real or perceived by people. And I want to try and make a few points there. I think part of the difficulty that many Americans are having is, and let me here also just say, one of the rules for the Veritas Forum is dialogue, not debate, and that is very, very, very important. Some of the things that I may say may come across as a little bit strong, but I want to ask the audience to not be offended by them, but simply take them. I articulate them in the spirit of learning, not in the spirit of provoking. So I think part of the problem that exists across America is a problem of sheer ignorance on the individual level that people have about Islam and about Muslims. They do not know much, or they do not know anything. They do not know, for example, about the central role of Jesus, peace be upon him, in the Quran, the holy scripture of Islam. They do not know about Jesus's virgin birth to his mother Mary. They do not know that Jesus is mentioned over 90 times in the Quran, always in the most praiseworthy terms. They do not know that the Quran, the sacred scripture of Islam, contains an entire chapter dedicated to the Virgin Mary, that she stands as the model for many Muslim women. If you'd ask a Muslim woman, why do you wear a headscarf? The answer would often be because the Virgin Mary, the purest of all women, covered her head. So there is much ignorance about how Islam sees Christianity, sees Jesus. Islam is often cast as sort of the opposite religion, a contender religion, a competitor religion. And that is the result sometimes or often out of sheer ignorance. Jesus is so important in our tradition that we named our son Jesus. The name of our son is Selim Isa. Some of you who have some Hebrew, maybe Selim is Salam, is Shalom, and Isa is Jesus. It means peace, Jesus. And we picked that name for him because of our deepest respect for Jesus, and also because we wanted to set a sign. Apart from the individual ignorance, however, I think there's also a politically driven exclusion of Muslims. And one manifestation is the emphasis that we continue hearing on the Judeo-Christian civilization here in the West, that our country is being built on a Judeo-Christian civilization, that we have Judeo-Christian values and so on and so forth. I recognize, of course, that there is a kinship, but it always comes to the exclusion of, for example, what could be called the Islamic civilization. Many people don't realize that the concept of a Judeo-Christian civilization is something relatively new, emerging and becoming prominent after the Second World War, and don't recognize the actual history that occurred between Jews and Christians. It was precisely Christian Europe that persecuted Jews for hundreds of centuries, leading to the terrible pogroms and then to the awful Holocaust. yet there's this fashioning of this Judeo-Christian civilization that comes at the exclusion of other civilizations. And so I would argue if we could refashion that to a Judeo-Christian, Islamo, and so on civilization towards in Germany we say Weltanschauung, a worldview that is less juxtapositional, the Judeo-Christian civilization versus the Islamic civilization, more towards a worldview that is compositional and that would describe world history actually much more accurately. I have 60 seconds left and I just want to make one more point if I can. It may take me 70 seconds. I apologize for that. Matthew mentioned that 9/11 at the beginning of the event. In the year 2008 or 9, the Center for the Study of Counterterrorism at West Point published a study, and in the media, the study was greeted as a study with surprising results. And the surprising results was that Al-Qaeda killed far more Muslims than it killed non-Muslims. Same is true for ISIS and for all these other groups. That wasn't a surprise to us Muslims at all. We know that very well. At this very moment, we have loved ones, family, and friends who are running away either from brutal dictators or from ISIS. And many are dying in that kind of process. Yet these simple facts are not out there in the media. And what instead emerges is an image of these terrorist actors who are not enemies of the West, but enemies of humanity, being some sort of representative of the Islamic civilization. And then presidential candidates can start saying things like Islam hates us, or Muslims should not be able to run for president in America, and so on and so forth, because there is this enemy image. I went over my time. I hope I presented some societal and political barriers. Maybe we can talk more later. Sorry for going over.
Oh no, that's fine. This is good. We're getting warmed up here, and we're gonna keep circling back, I think, to a number of the things that you raised. I've got one more big question that I'm gonna pose to our two guests here, and then we're gonna hear from our audience, from our students. And I'm gonna flip it a little bit. I'm not going to give you a break, Dr. Malici. I'm going to come back to you with the next question. The question as it's written asks us what we can learn from our non-Christian neighbors. But I'm going to exercise the rights of a moderator here. I'm going to tweak this for you. And what I want to ask you is, what can Christians learn from Muslim neighbors? What are things that you would hope that your Christian students and your Christian neighbors can learn from you, or from others in the Muslim community that we're not going to come up with on our own?
I appreciate that question very much, and it would be presumptuous to me to talk maybe beyond what they can learn from Muslims. We are Muslims. I thought of 2 or 3 items that I may suggest often when I participate in interfaith events. And I would go down the pillars of Islam. One of the pillars of Islam is to do the 5 daily prayers. And the 5 daily prayers in Islam, they're 5 formalized prayers. Each one is preceded by a washing of much of your body, and then you retreat into silence, into solitude, or in congregation whenever possible, but you remove yourself from worldly affairs, and you're trying to enter the world of godly godly presence. And whenever I speak about this retreat 5 times a day at different times of the day, at first, students are, well, isn't that very disruptive? I mean, at noon you need to go to the bathroom and wash and then pray, and in the afternoon again, and then in the evening again, and at night again, and in the morning, and so on and so forth. But that disruption is precisely the point, to remove ourselves from the materialism, from the hedonism, from the self-convictions, from the delusions, from the distractions of this world, seek the proximity of God, and ask for forgiveness that we have committed in the meantime. and so on and so forth. And I often observe that when students start thinking about that, they see the virtue in that, in this continuous retreat, that there is something to that. And then they start thinking about how that would translate for themselves as Christians. Mm. So that is maybe one thing. And the other thing I want to mention is some of you in the audience may be aware that Muslims are fasting for 1 month every year. That is the month of Ramadan. That month occurs at different times of the year, every year about 10 years earlier. It's due to the lunar calendar. But for a period of 1 month, Muslims don't eat anything from dawn to sunset. And in the summer, that can be easily 15, 16, 17 hours, depending on exactly 18 hours. Where you live, there is no eating, there is no drinking of water, no consumption of anything. And the purpose of course, is to train ourselves in virtues that are also Christian virtues: discipline, strength, steadfastness, abstinence, and so on and so forth. And that is mandatory upon every Muslim. This what seems to many hardcore fasting. But again, when I talk about that, and I ask students, well, how is fasting in your tradition? They know that fasting exists in their tradition, but they know very little about beyond that. They know often very little beyond that, but I at the same time see in them again, even though it appears hardcore to them, I could not do it. I see in them at the same time a respect for, wow, this is somebody with this kind of dedication who does that, and I see the value in putting all these bodily needs for eating, for drinking, for sexual engagement, all on the back burner and bringing to the forefront my spiritual self, a month of retreat, of increased supplication. And the students recognize that. And so I always think, about Jesus. It is said he's said to have fasted 40 days. And if whether you're Muslim or not, I think such a retreat and such a fast is of benefit and of virtue to all of us. I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I would say just personally that really resonates with some of my experience in teaching as well. I don't teach on Islam in the religion department, but I remember my first teaching job at Aurora University in Illinois. I had to teach a course on world religions, and so part of the way I did that is I organized field trips to a bunch of religious communities, because in Chicago you've got everything. And we visited a mosque in Aurora, and they were the day we showed up, they were wrapping up one of their youth education programs, and they had a couple of kids in the religious community there who had just finished memorizing the entire Quran. And I understand that in the Islamic tradition, this is fairly common. Not everybody does it, but the emphasis on memorization of sacred scripture is something that's taken with great seriousness. And I remember thinking, how much more the Muslims in this community were committed to knowing their own scriptures than most of the students in my classes who have been fairly nominal Christians. And it really, the impact it had on me was making me think, wow, I really need to step up my game here. We'll toss it over to Dr. Kaemingk now. And so the question for you is, how can we learn from our non-Christian neighbors, and how does Christian love draw us beyond just the sort of mere idea of tolerance?
Yeah, well, I think we just learned, right, what we can learn from our Muslim neighbors. I think that was a wonderful example of the ways in which we can learn something about our own past as Christians, that fasting has been a big part of the Christian faith for many centuries. And for American evangelicals and Protestants like myself, we have lost touch with those resources within our faith. And we evangelicals tend to look down on rituals that we do. We think of rituals as a bad thing. We can think of Christianity as something that we do inside of our heads or something that we do inside of our hearts, but we don't think of Christianity as something that we do with our bodies, right? And what we just heard reminds us that actually historically the Christian faith is something you're supposed to do with your body. It's a way of life. It's a way of walking and following Jesus and serving others. It's something that you do. And here, with an encounter with my Muslim brother, I am reminded of that. I am challenged by that, and I'm inspired. So right there, we have an example of that. But I think further, we as Christians need to reflect on why we dialogue rather than simply monologue with our Muslim neighbors. And it comes from the fact that I believe God calls us to be curious about the world and curious about the people that God has created. God gave us minds that long to learn. And one of the chief benefits of dialogue with Muslims, interacting with them, is that you can learn something about yourself, about them, about your world. These are human beings who are made in the image of God, who long for justice and freedom and family, and they live in God's world just like we do. And so here is this tremendous opportunity for us to learn and listen. And I think for me, a personal story, one of my dear Muslim friends, his name is Shadi Hamid, and he and I have done a number of Muslim Christian dialogues at Christian campuses and whatnot around the country. And one evening he had read the book of Galatians, which is a book in the New Testament that has to do with law and grace, and God's law and God's grace for us. And he had read this, and he showed genuine interest and asked me questions and was wrestling with this concept of grace. And there at the table, as we were talking, I got the opportunity to wrestle with this concept of grace that I've known since I was a little kid, and I've been singing songs and Bible stories, and I'm a theologian, right? So we talk about grace. But there at that table with him, the grace of God came alive for me. The grace that I've experienced in Jesus Christ came alive for me in a powerful way that I had not experienced in church. But it was because he was honestly wrestling with how do you put the law of God together with the grace of God? And I had to wrestle with him in that. And it was a really powerful personal experience for me. And so I think that we as Christians are called to this curiosity, called to this dialogue, and we cannot help but be blessed because God is moving in the world, and God is moving outside of the church, and we have an opportunity to learn and to listen. And so, yeah, that's important for me. I don't know if I was getting all at what you were aiming at there, but those were just some thoughts that came to me as I was listening to Dr. Malici. Actually, David, if I could jump in, there was something Dr. Malici said earlier about a conglomeration of faiths. And I think as we talk about pluralism and democracy, and what does it look like for America to be a Judeo-Christian Islamo society, those questions are really important because religions tend to, we're tempted to dominance rather than to pluralism, right? Living alongside deep difference. So when we encounter a religious minority, we're tempted to either dominate them or to try to assimilate them into us, or to sort of run away from the difference or avoid the difference. Or, as we've talked about in this title, beyond tolerance, one of the problems we can do is we can engage in sort of a distant tolerance, where you do your thing and I'll do my thing. And as long as we don't bump into each other, that's fine. And it's sort of a disinterested tolerance. And that's a real struggle. And I'd like our political scientists to speak to that in terms of the health of democracy and how sort of a disinterested tolerance isn't quite enough. I'm curious, if the good professor would speak to that a little bit.
I think the good professor would take a long time here, and potentially take away a lot of space from the students. But if I may just say one brief thing here, and that is tonight it's about Christian-Muslim interactions and relations. And I have the privilege to talk about that, but we must not forget all the others. I knew a rabbi once in town here, and we went out to lunch, and he told me there's a large number of Jewish students at many of these colleges who are not identifying as Jews. Because of fear of being prejudiced against and stereotypes, and so I want to emphasize, while we're talking about Christianity and Islam today here, that we're not creating an exclusivity there, but that we all, in my conviction, have a responsibility to anyone, whoever they are, to not make them feel afraid to be who they are.
Okay, good. We've got some questions coming in from the students now. And our first question is for Dr. Malici, and the student is wondering, how have you experienced Islamophobia yourself since moving to this country? Do you maybe have, I know this can be personal and perhaps even painful, but do you have a story or an anecdote you'd be willing to share with us? And has it gotten worse in the last 4 years under the Trump administration?
Yes, unfortunately, Islamophobia is very real, and I have my own personal experiences, and my family has experiences, and our community has experiences. I'm gonna share maybe a couple of examples, but not so that anyone feels sorry or bad for us, but so that we feel encouraged in our citizenship to make the social fabric of this great country ever firmer and ever stronger, and mend the injuries it has sustained. So that's why I will share some of these examples. On the community level, some years ago, our mosque has been burned down here in Greenville, and that was, of course, traumatic to the community. My wife is the principal of an Islamic school here, and it did happen that when that school takes a field trip, for example, to the Peace Center, that the girls, they wear the hijab, the head covering, and then on the seats behind our Muslim children would be another school class, and the children of that other school class would grab the headscarves and ask whether there would be a grenade or a bomb underneath. My wife often, with the car, when she approaches an intersection that has several lanes, she never stops precisely parallel to the car in the parallel lane, but always a little bit behind or a little bit ahead, so that the other driver in the parallel lane couldn't recognize her as a Muslim and potentially do something to her. It did happen to her that people yelled to her at the public parking lot, "You sand," and then the N-word, go back home. She's from Kansas, but those are just the assumptions. on a personal level, one very painful experience was when at Furman we have a faculty. We used to have a faculty dining and staff room. It's still there, but it used to be much more frequented. And a senior colleague there, not in my presence, but in the presence of everyone else, asked whether I ever apologized for 9/11, and that was relayed to me. And so, unfortunately, there is a lot of that. When we moved into our neighborhood, into our new neighborhood, what we did is we bought a whole bunch of Turkish chocolate and went to every neighboring house and introduced ourselves and gave them the Turkish chocolate. And that's a nice gesture, you might say, but it was also to let them know we're here as Muslims and we're not bad guys. So these things, unfortunately, are there, but we are not devastated by them. We recognize an imperative towards committed authorship of a book that is called America, in which the next chapter will always carry more justice and more beauty and more equality for all of us. So in these difficulties, there is vocation, and we embrace it. So nobody feel sad about what I just said, but hopefully inspired towards a compassionate citizenship.
Well, Dr. Malici, thanks for sharing those personal stories. And Dr. Kaemingk, I wonder what your thoughts in reaction to that might be, and especially, getting back to the how Christians can counteract this kind of Islamophobia when we see it. I mean, I'm on the one hand, I'm really inspired. I love the story. I love the story of the chocolate. I love, I would love to have a neighbor who'd bring me chocolate. And yet at the same time, there's part of me that's sad that you feel like you have to do that, right? That we've created a culture in which the onus is on you to prove that you're harmless and that you're one of the good Muslims whom we can trust. And so I wonder if Dr. Kaemingk can help us think through, especially those of us who identify as Christian, how can we work against that? How can we make our neighborhoods and our communities places where a Muslim can move in and not have to bring me chocolate in order to feel welcome?
Yeah, well, so there's a number of things to say here. One is honestly, food diplomacy is the best, and it's wonderful, right? It's absolutely wonderful. I'll share a couple of stories from the Netherlands, because that's where I was really studying how Christians were responding in positive ways towards their Muslim neighbors. One was so they had a number of arsons, attacks against Muslim mosques and community centers and schools during one particular uprising. 70 arsons in the space of a few months in a particularly heated time. And a number of pastors, these were Pentecostal pastors, got together and circled their local mosque. And they knocked on the door, and there were Muslims inside, and they were clearly afraid. And they said, we're the Pentecostals from down the street, and we're so sorry this is happening, and we are going to circle your mosque every night until this stops, until this burning stops. And they organized Pentecostals and evangelicals from all over the country to do this, to guard the mosques as their witness. So one thing to do is just pure defensive, right? When you hear comments that are inappropriate, when you see things being attacked, put your body between them, right? That's a core Christian belief, right? That we put others before ourselves. Another one on the food diplomacy, I met a very energetic church planter who is doing ministry in a Muslim neighborhood in downtown Amsterdam. And he was a Dutchman, and he was very excited to reach the Muslims in the neighborhood. And his idea was to cook them food, and he would care for them. And his plan fell apart. It was, no one came to his meals. I'm not sure if it was the Dutch food or what, but they did not come to his meals. And in reflecting on this, he had found that Muslim immigrants were in the Netherlands constantly being cared for. They were the objects of charity all the time. And so people would look down on them. And they were tired of it. And this church planter felt like he had done this, he was a failure. Nothing was working. And one night, his next door neighbor, I believe she was, her family was Ethiopian. They invited him in to have dinner with them. And he started asking them questions as they had dinner. And she started to share, her family was there eating, about how her mother had taught her this recipe and gotten it from her grandmother in Ethiopia. And this was an opportunity for him to serve as a guest. So often we think of ourselves as the hosts with all the power and all the privilege, and we call the shots and we set the table. But this is an opportunity for us to think about, what does it look like to be a guest who asks questions, who learns, who puts ourselves in the guest position. But finally, I serve as a board member for an organization called Neighborly Faith. Neighborly Faith, you can go to neighborlyfaith.org. And it is a coalition of evangelical Christians who want to be neighborly to other faiths in America: Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, Hinduism. And they work with Christian colleges around the country to build relationships and to learn how to practice hospitality. And frankly, it's the practice that really matters, which means that the first time you run out, to make a friend or to have a meal, is you'll make mistakes when you're, interacting with your Muslim friend or your Jewish friend or your Hindu friend. But that's okay. We practice. And democracy, or as we talk about politics, democracy depends upon people reaching out a vulnerable hand. Right now in American politics, everyone has this kind of a posture, right? Everybody is tight and in, and there's no opportunity for real interaction and vulnerability. And our democracy is crying out for people who are willing to be guests and willing to be hosts and willing to sit around a table and vulnerably share their stories. We just heard a vulnerable story, right? We heard a number of vulnerable stories from our brother. And people aren't really sharing those vulnerable stories right now. Right now, it's fists. And so the call, I would say to my Christian brothers and sisters, is learn to be vulnerable, and reach out and ask questions and make mistakes.
We've got a question here about what we might call intellectual hospitality. And that is, moving beyond the pleasantries of, just coming and going, sitting down and actually having a serious conversation about core beliefs, theological beliefs, religious beliefs. Where is the line between, this question has to do with the danger of religious syncretism. Is that even a danger that Muslims and Christians should worry about? Is there a line in which hospitality can bleed over into a kind of undefined mush, where your own core beliefs and core practices are being diluted or watered down? Is that something we should worry about?
I'll say a couple quick things here, and then Dr. Malici can clean up my mess. I would say that, it is sort of commonly said sometimes that all religions are the same, or all religions are headed up the same mountain. We all pray to the same God. And often these comments are thrown out of good intentions, right? We just want to be generous, and we want people to get along. We don't want the fighting. But I don't like those kinds of comments for a number of reasons. One is I just think it's factually not true. There are very deep differences between these faiths, deep and important differences. But second of all, when you say those things, you're not taking those differences seriously. And honestly, you're not taking these people seriously. So you imagine yourself to be generous when you say we all believe the same thing. But what it really means is I'm not interested in hearing what you actually believe. I just want us to all get along. And so part of authentic hospitality is taking those differences seriously and allowing them to be there, allowing there to be real difference and not being afraid of that and naming it and exploring it. We have real differences over who Jesus is and what Jesus has done, and that's okay. Trying to boil Jesus down into a mush that no one disagrees with is not taking Jesus seriously, right? Jesus said some very hard, clear things that demand a clear response from us. So, yes, religious syncretism is a danger. It absolutely is. And it's really important that we take our differences seriously. It's no good if a guest comes to your home and you say to them, "Don't worry, I know that we all like the same kinds of food. So I cooked my favorite food for you because I know that you like the food I like." And you show no real interest in them. Real hospitality takes those differences seriously.
Especially if it's pork chops, huh? So, Matthew, as you were describing, your response to, that sort of the mountain metaphor or the elephant metaphor that sort of presumes a flat identity of all these various traditions. I mean, I wonder if there's an analogy in a way to how some people talk about race and the idea of colorblindness. And, I think in a lot of the kind of ongoing conversation, national conversation about race and identity, there's been a widespread recognition, I think, that metaphor of colorblindness can be really unhelpful because it just papers over the lived realities of the people of color have had to experience by virtue of this difference that they didn't construct and that they didn't ask for. And there's a way of engaging with religious difference that does something really, really similar, right? It's just, it sounds very high-minded, but you're just sort of looking past the difference. And what you end up doing is assimilating them back into yourself, right? You end up saying, these differences are insignificant in a way that ends up, your experience, whether we're talking about race, whiteness being the norm, or people who talk about all religions kind of being the one usually give you a kind of, liberal Protestant version of what they think that religion is, and everyone's just supposed to agree to that. So have you ever thought about, like a kind of either of you, thinking about some of those conversations about race being a sort of parallel way in which we can maybe unintentionally assimilate the other back into ourselves in a way that's damaging?
Briefly to what Matthew just said, and then I'll come to that race and other identity question. But to the religious identity, I very much agree with what Matthew was saying. Earlier on, I emphasized the importance of Jesus in Islam and how often he's mentioned in the Quran, the sacred scripture of Islam. But there also differences. Muslims do not consider him to be God or the Son of God or anything like that. He's a God-sent messenger, a very important one, and that somebody who came with a book, the Injil, the Gospel. But he is not the Son of God or anything like that. And that is, of course, a fundamental difference. Another fundamental difference is Muslims do not consider Jesus to have died on the cross. And so there's other theological differences. And to make statements like we're all the same, and indeed is doing injustice to the religious identity of all participants. I think there are theological differences, and the task should not be to talk them away, but I think the task should be to recognize, while there are theological differences, there is so much space for ethical agreements among the faiths. Christians and Muslims and Jews have fundamental theological agreements, but they have also fundamental ethical agreements. And I think it is often unproductive when the conversation gets stuck on the theological level and forgets to move on to the ethical level. And that is where the constructiveness, where the productiveness is sitting. And so that's the point I want to make about that. About these other identities, there's a very important verse in the Quran. As Muslims, we consider them all important, but in one verse, God says, we created you all from the same origin, and we could have made you all alike, but we didn't. And so the question is, well, God, why didn't you when you could have? And God answers, well, instead we made you into different nations and tribes. Nations not in the political sense we understand today, but we made you into different nations and tribes and ethnicities and races and so on and so forth. Well, so God, why did you do that? And the answer is so that you could come to know each other, because you would be curious to each other, so that you would come to know each other and raise each other in all virtues. And this understanding of difference that leaves intact the identity of the other absolutely, and in fact embraces that identity as divine. That is the vision of identity that I want to have for America. And that unfortunately I'm seeing us not moving towards these days. And whether we are Christian or Muslim, I'm certain there's and Brother Matthew talked about, there's a correspondent Christian ethic about this togetherness that I just tried to articulate. We will continue having the theological differences, but on the ethical level, there is so much space for us to co-offer something better for all of us.
Yeah, I just want another word on the race. I think for white people in general, we struggle with difference. Difference makes us uncomfortable, whether it's racial difference or religious difference. And so we want to neutralize that difference and that discomfort as quickly as possible. And so we will try to say things like, I don't see race, or we all worship the same God, just simply to neutralize the discomfort that we're feeling. And so really the question is, how comfortable are you with discomfort? Can you sit with deep difference at the table? Can you open yourself vulnerably to listen to your Black brothers and sisters tell their hard stories about what it's like to be Black in America? Can you sit with your Muslim brothers and sisters and listen to their hard stories that are very different from your own? Right? Your experience of America is very different than these stories. And can you sit with those deep differences and listen to them rather than painting a big brush over them and say, we're all the same. I see us as all the same, and not really take your neighbors seriously, frankly.
Okay, well, let's move to another question from our student audience. And this one will maybe push us back into the realm of Dr. Malici's expertise in international relations and politics. But how do we in America, as a multi-religious country emphasizing pluralism, also acknowledge global Muslim states that arguably do not practice pluralism? And you're obviously free to engage with the premise of that question, or just at a broader level, how, insofar as we are a pluralistic country, how do we engage with other societies that are not?
Yeah, that is true. Unfortunately, many Muslim countries are far removed from Islamic ideals, are dictatorships, are authoritarian, are engaged in religious persecution, are engaged in oppression and repression of minorities. That is very correct. It is very unfortunate that this opens a question that we could talk about for a long time. Before I say that, it is precisely because of what I just mentioned that we are experiencing the refugee crisis in Europe and in other parts of the world. That people are, having been living in repressive and oppressive and undignified circumstances in these authoritarian states for decades, and seeking a better life in Europe or in other parts of the West, in countries where they actually could practice their religion freely. That often they cannot in those countries where they're from. One question to engage here would be, well, how come there are these countries, and what should be our role towards them? Maybe I'll make it short here, otherwise it'll take too much time. One of the bigger human rights violators in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia. One of the biggest U.S. allies in the Middle East is also Saudi Arabia. So it is, unfortunately, Egypt is not far behind. The United Arab Emirates are not far behind. So there's also many internal issues that have happened in those countries that contributed to them being in an abysmal state when it comes to issues of human rights, of freedom, of liberty, and so on and so forth. And we could talk for those about a long time, but I think you asked about our positioning. And here it would be maybe worthwhile to examine to what extent our perceived national interest made us collaborate or enable or encourage situations in those countries that have contributed to the disastrous affairs that we can see there. That's for sure not the only factor. There's many more, but that would be one factor for us to consider. Why do we have this cozy relationship with some states there who are in such flagrant violation of Muslim ethics, Christian ethics, and so on and so forth?
You know, a question like that can be asked from a perspective of genuine, genuine puzzlement and curiosity about how best to engage at a political level, I think, it can also be asked as, from a place of suspicion, right? And connected to the immigration debate as well, right? The idea that I think in the minds of some people, there's a fear that immigrants from Muslim countries are coming here to undermine a pluralistic society, as sort of sleeper agents who are, they get enough of them here and they're going to be able to vote in Sharia law, and then Oklahoma is going to become the next Saudi Arabia. Can you, my experience with, and this is very unscientific, but interacting with Muslim immigrants is that they come to Western countries precisely because they don't want to live in places like Saudi Arabia. That the pluralism of our society is a selling point. It's not something to be overcome. Is that fair?
Yeah, let me take a minute here and speak to that question of Sharia. There's a lot of misunderstanding. Sharia means in Arabic the path to the watering hole for the camel in ancient Arabic. And so more figuratively, it means the path to the source. The path to what source? The path to the divine source in each one of us. And so the Sharia is intended to take us to this path, to this divine source in us. That divine source in us, Muslims, Arabs refer to as the fitra. The fitra is a moral compass that God has planted within each one of us. It sits somewhere in here, a moral compass within each one of us. And that moral compass tells us what is just and what is unjust, what is good and what is bad, what is beautiful and what is ugly. The Muslim belief is that God did plant that fitra in somewhere here. Now, what happens in the course of life, that fitra, through our life experiences, gets darkened, gets covered up, and you don't see it as much anymore. It doesn't command us as much as it should, because it is covered up. Sharia is the path back to this divine compass. That is what Sharia means. Now philosophically, now more legally, and this will be difficult for students to accept, so I would recommend everyone go on Google afterwards and type in Sharia and purpose of Sharia, or the Arabic Maqasid al-Sharia, Maqasid, M-A-K-S-A-I-D of Sharia, and the student and everybody will find there are 5 purposes of the Sharia. And one of them is the preservation of life. The other one is the preservation of lineage. Then there's the preservation of property, the preservation of faith, and so on. And when we look at these purposes, at these goals of the Sharia, often when I ask students and when I show them in the classroom, what does this remind you of? It often reminds them of the United States Constitution. And so my summary of that is, these people come to America not because they want to bring Sharia to America. They want to come to America because America has Sharia. And it's the US Constitution that preserves the right to property, that preserves the right to life, that preserves the right to lineage, that preserves the right to faith, and so on and so forth. That Sharia was not given to them in the countries that they're fleeing from. They're coming to America because America has Sharia, not because they want to bring Sharia.
That's a really beautiful way of putting it. How do you approach your roles as supporters of interfaith dialogue, knowing that both in Islamic tradition and in Christian faith, as those are oftentimes portrayed, the final destinations are different, right? The final kind of ultimate end of salvation in Christianity and in Islam, there is an ultimate divergence in who gets saved and what that looks like. The kind of ultimate transcendent beyond this world ends toward which religious practice is devoted. Does that put tension in your experience or in your views on practicing a genuine, open, hospitable interfaith dialogue?
So we have a storm here, tropical storm Beta. Can you hear me?
Yes, we've got you. Beta. They've run out of proper names. We're now to the Greek alphabet.
So there is no tension for me because I believe that God saves people, not me. So I don't have an urgency. I don't have a sense of urgency about saving people because that's not my job. I don't have to change people's minds. I don't have to change people's hearts because I can't do that anyways. And that's not my responsibility. I have a very clear responsibility as a follower of Jesus, and that is to love my neighbor, to do justice to my neighbor, to be humble towards my neighbor, to make space, not just for the neighbors that I like, but even the neighbors who might scare me or might even declare themselves to be my enemy. Those are my responsibilities. Salvation is God's. Justice, ultimate justice is God's. And so that releases my grip. It relaxes my shoulders. And it relaxes the way that I interact with other religions, other political parties, other ideologies, because it is not my task to save the world or to take back America for any particular group. I am responsible to Jesus alone. And so that relaxes me. And that's, yeah. And I think that if God made space for me when I was still his enemy, then that means God has purchased me. God owns me. And so I must make space for others. That's core to what I understand it to be, the gospel. So yeah, that would be my statement.
Okay. On this question, I once heard a pastor saying that's above my pay grade, and that was the complete answer to that.
That's something we say in the military.
Yeah. I hope that as a Muslim, I will be admitted to paradise. But I hope to see you all there as well. The only unforgivable sin in Islam is atheism or polytheism. Every other sin is forgivable. A general conclusion that maybe I could give is the following, if I just may. I came to the United States in the 90s, and I attended Arizona State University. And right across the street, there was the mosque where I went for prayers. And right next to the mosque, there was a church. And right next to the church, there was a synagogue. And that's, by the way, the case also for our mosque here in Greenville. And you would look at this image and you would think, in America only, to be sure, it's not only in America, it's also elsewhere. But I always like to think this is America at its best. This is America at its most beautiful. It's sort of a perfect microcosm that we experienced there right off campus of Arizona State University. And I think it is upon us to make that microcosm a macrocosm for ever more Americans. We have our beautiful ideals, but our reality often deviates from those ideals, and Catholics know this, and Jews know this, and Muslims know this, and Native Americans know this, and African Americans know this, and so on and so forth. And our faiths, whether we are Christian, and most of the audience is Christian, or Muslims or Jews, I think do have imperatives to align the ideals that we proclaim for our country ever more with the reality for America, for ever more people. And I saw this evening exactly in this spirit, and I was blessed to be part of it. Thank you very much.